Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for joining. We're here to talk about small groups. We're going to get into this in just a second. Just want to say thanks for everybody who's joining. I'm going to go ahead and put some slides up on the screen. Thanks everybody for joining, especially for joining on such short notice. This is the second time we've done this live training. This is the one that we'll record. We'll put this up on on our website, y2am.org/small groups, for those who are not able to join. Not able to join live. Feel free to share this when the time comes. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, if you don't have a piece of paper, if you don't have a pen, or just something up for taking notes, I would go ahead and grab that, because I think taking notes is going to be helpful. I am going to point you to some resources later, but taking notes always helps me kind of keep my thoughts organized. So feel free to get some utensils, I guess, so you can do that. So here's some goals for the time that we're going to spend together today. Going to kind of keep this at kind of a very low level, or kind of introductory level. One, I want to introduce what small groups are. Two, I want to explore why they're so important. Because this is something that a lot of communities around the church now are looking into, especially under the circumstances. And three, I want to point you some helpful resources that can help you to make this a reality in your particular ministry, in your particular parish, whatever that might be. So we'll talk about what they are, why they're so important, especially at this particular time, and I want to point you to some helpful resources that are going to help you make this a reality. And plus, if you stick around to the end, there's a special bonus that I want to share with you for your communities and your parishes, something that I think is going to be really helpful for you. So where do we find ourselves today? At home, most likely, right? We're in a very unique time. Not just because it's Holy Week, which only happens once a year, but we're in this weird sort of period where ministry has been exclusively happening at home. I mean, we are tuning into live stream services rather than going to church in person. We are tuning in to various ministry groups and church groups via, Zoom and Hangout and whatever sort of digital platform that we want, rather than meeting with people together in person. And honestly, it is so encouraging and wonderful to me the way that a lot of ministry leaders across the church have really stepped up and have helped to create some of these live streams and educational opportunities. And there's a lot of really wonderful, inspirational, informative, helpful stuff that's being shared, especially in the midst of these difficulties. And I'm super, super grateful for that. And it's really helping connect people. Although it's interesting, during the midst of these live streams as well, I'm seeing something, and I wonder if you're seeing it too, a need that's not quite being met under the circumstances. This is something that I've seen while I tune into live stream services, like everybody is there and they're kind of listening to the prayers, and you'll have this side conversation that's going on in the chat, right? Like, it's not the sort of thing that you would normally happen during church services. And maybe there's a little bit of whispering, but it's discouraged at least. But you'll have these people chatting with each other, like, hello, this is Steve from here, and this is whoever from here. And you see this desire for people to really reach out, this desire to see others and to be seen by others, this desire for connection with our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. And it's something that we're missing because of the circumstances, as we're all sort of quarantined and we're apart from each other. And it's a need that's really hard to fill when it comes to this kind of online model that we've been using in order to compensate under the circumstances. Because I think there are two dimensions to ministry. One of them, we're doing a really great job meeting, but the other one right now in this online sort of environment, we're not. And I think we're at least not as much. And I think that's one of the challenges that I want to be able to, or the needs that I think we can fill with this small group sort of model. What do I mean by these two dimensions? There's kind of the vertical and the horizontal, right? On the vertical sense, we connect people to what we call ministries, right? Or we connect people to a message. When we broadcast something out, when people tune in, when they watch a sermon or watch a video or listen to a podcast or whatever it might be, it's kind of something vertical. We're connecting people to a group, or we're connecting people to some sort of information, right, to some sort of message. And again, we are great at doing that. There's a lot of really wonderful opportunities for that. And that's one need that we have as Christians, to be inspired, to be informed, right? But there's also this horizontal need. There's this desire that we have to reach out to each other as well. Not simply to learn, but to connect with each other. And that is difficult under the best of circumstances, but I think it's become even more difficult as we've all been sort of stuck online trying to figure things out over the course of the last month or so. It's especially hard when there's a lot of people in the room, right? And this is actually one of the ways that we tend to measure the success of ministry, if you think about it. Like back in the good old days when there were places and we used to do things in places with other people, right? And an event, a ministry event would happen. One of the first questions that we would ask to judge whether it was successful or not was, how many people showed up? Right? The implicit assumption was if there were more people that came, it was a better or more successful ministry experience. And that's great, right? But when it comes to ministry, there's also that personal connection. There's also that horizontal connection. And bigger isn't necessarily better all the time. Bigger can satisfy one particular axis, right? Bigger gets more people together for a big sort of group, but bigger doesn't necessarily facilitate this horizontal connection between individual persons. It's very, very easy to get lost in the crowd. And that's become even easier today as we find ourselves online, right? When I close my eyes and I think, like, what has ministry been? How has ministry transitioned over the course of the last few weeks? I kind of think of something like this. I think of little Zoom boxes of my friends and my fellow parishioners and other people, right? And even total strangers, all these little faces, this pixelated sort of Brady Bunch-esque level of boxes, right? As we're all there. And it's great because it's a way to bring people together, to hear a good word, right? And we all need a good word in our lives. But one of the troubles is that horizontal connection is so difficult here, right? This is how so many of us are getting together nowadays. I've seen it with live streams that we've been doing at Y2AM. I've seen it at parish youth groups. I've helped to do some retreats with parishes around the country over the course of the last couple of weeks. And you have so much of this, which is great, which is really great. I don't want to undermine like how incredibly wonderful it is that we can do this, thank God, right? And yet it's really hard for us to connect with other people when we are just one box in this pixelated mosaic of boxes. It's easier for us to connect. It's easier for us to hear a word. It's easy for us to learn, but it's hard sometimes for us to connect with each other. You know, it can be really hard, especially if you have introverted tendencies, to get lost in a real crowd, right? In the analog world. It can be that much harder to get lost in this crowd, this mosaic, right? This pixelated landscape of ministry today. And that's something we need to address because that need exists and we need to fill it. We're doing a great job connecting people with messages, really uplifting, really good messages. I think we can do a better job connecting people to each other. We can do something more personal. We can do something that can help people build intentional and strong and faithful Christian community where people know each other and are known by each other. Right? Something that focuses on their connection between each other. This is where small groups come in. And this is the model that I want to share with you today as potential small group leaders. Rather than bunching people up into big impersonal online chats, which serve their purpose, small groups offers a complement to that good work, right? It approaches good work from a different direction with a different sort of model. Small groups offers a way to break people up into small groups so we can bring people together in this more personal way and better address that horizontal need to connect people to each other. So let's be crystal clear right from the back, in case you haven't heard of this before, what exactly are small groups? Thankfully, they are exactly what they sound like. Small groups are made up of between 6 to 8 people. Right? So it's a relatively smaller group than kind of the 20 or 30 or 40 people potentially that we might have in a bigger ministry, the way we sometimes do youth and young adult ministries, right? Depending on the size of the parish. So it's made up of 6 to 8 people, a smaller group, led by a small group leader. They'll meet every week to learn and pray together. So it's kind of this intimate group that meets on a regular basis. And the cool thing about this model is that you can apply it to any existing ministry, or you can use it to bring people together in a different sort of way. So think about this, for instance. If you had a youth program in your community or a young adult program in your community, and you've got 20 or 30 or 40 people, right? If it's a bigger parish and you've got a lot of people who are there. One option is to use this small group model and break people up in that ministry every now and again into something smaller so it can be an opportunity for them to connect and see each other and be seen. So instead of 20 or 30 or 40 people in a room, in a Zoom room, as the case has been over the course of the last few weeks, it's 6 to 8 people with a small group leader to bring them together to facilitate conversation, to facilitate connection. And this can be a wonderful complement to the bigger meeting. People come together as a big group for something and then break off into smaller groups for more personal sort of work at the same time. A wonderful complement to the existing great work that's happening. Or you can use it to bring people from different ministries together. So instead of like small groups of youth groups, small groups of young adults, You can have small groups of families potentially. So it's a bunch of different ages, different families that are connected together. Or you can have a small group that includes like teenagers and young adults and older adults. So you can have these small groups that actually reflect kind of a slice of the larger life and diversity of the community. It's not just people of one group that are getting together. It's people from different demographics, different walks of life, which can be so wonderful for young people to be able to look up to somebody who's walked further along their Christian life and can kind of be that sort of mentor, be somebody who can help sustain them and help lead them on their journey to Christ. So we can be really experimental. We can be really creative with this basic model of bringing people together for something more personal and connective. The thing I will say, of course, for parishes that are in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America, we've adopted the policies for the safety of children and youth. So I do want to flag that, right? If this is a model that you want to bring into your existing youth groups, just to be mindful about that, because the existing policies, the policies for the safety of children and youth, kind of make sure that we have a safe, healthy environment for all of the kids in our care. And we can do sort of this new and creative model, but we definitely want to make sure that we're sensitive to the existing needs of the policies. As whatever we do in ministry, it should always be safe and healthy, because it's in that health and in that safety that we create this safe space for people to encounter the Lord and to know Jesus Christ, and the safety to allow themselves to be known by others. So just kind of a pin in that for the parishes and the communities that applies to. So a question might be coming to you, though, as we talk about this, as we talk about breaking down existing ministries into smaller chunks or potentially mixing people together. Who's going to lead all that, right? It seems like we're going to need more people in charge when it comes to stuff like that. Who's going to do it? Who has the ability and the training to be able to teach people in a situation like this? Do we need more seminary grads, right? Do we need more clergy? Well, maybe this question is part of the challenge that we need to talk about here today, right? Because I think the cool thing about this small groups model is that it's not simply about instruction, right? It's about connection. It's about facilitating personal connection between small groups of people that can get to know each other. They're not simply there to kind of learn something else. They're there to get to learn each other, to know each other, and connect with each other. There's a lot of great ministry work that happens out there, right? And the default that we tend to have is we tend to think of ministry as almost kind of synonymous with instruction, right? I've seen this in parishes around the country. You see this all the time, right? Ministry is about passing on Orthodox perspectives. Ministry is about teaching people something, informing people something. And that's why we need to make sure that people are like seminary grads or clergy, right? People who have the training and the ability to pass on the basics of the Orthodox Christian faith. And that's 100% true, right? Like that all makes a lot of sense. If we're going to be teaching the faith, we want to make sure that the people who are doing the teaching know what they're talking about, so they can share something that is true and share something that is uplifting. And that's important. And that's not what I'm getting at here, though, with this small groups model. It's not simply about, like we said, instruction. It's more about connection. It is about bringing people together. And you don't need an expert. You don't need to be an expert to do that. You don't need a seminary degree to bring people together, as we'll explore a little bit, right? So we do have people in our communities who can be empowered for these leadership roles. And it's going to be a wonderful opportunity to foster that intentional sort of Christian community that you don't get in the same sort of way when you have these big crowds where individuals feel kind of lost sometimes. So these are kind of important questions that I think we talk about ministry, right? What we believe, if you're at all familiar with our work at Y2AM, ministry is about more than information, right? Information is important, but ministry fundamentally, good ministry fundamentally, is about transformation. And that transformation happens in relationship. It happens in relationship with our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. It happens in relationship with each other, in these relational connections between people. So what we need to do is empower more people to do this, more people to facilitate these kinds of transformational interactions, more people who can know each other, lift each other up, support each other through difficult times, lean on each other, and build really good, connective, intentional Christian ministry. And that's something a lot of our fellow parishioners, a lot of our fellow Christians are perfectly positioned to do if we go about this with intentionality. So if you're an Orthodox Christian, though, you might be a little bit wary about this model, because if you've ever heard the word small groups before, you might have heard the word small groups in the context of like a Protestant congregation, right? That is certainly where the concept originated a few decades ago. But I want to assure you on two levels that this is a model that totally makes sense within our Orthodox Christian communities for two reasons. First, I personally know, and you actually might as well, I personally know Orthodox Christian clergy who have piloted these kinds of programs in their communities across the church. And they're seeing a lot of really wonderful fruit that's growing from this creativity and from adopting this kind of model. Right now, actually, OCF, Orthodox Christian Fellowship, is a national ministry that is going to begin to pilot this as well, and to really use this thing to bring college students together in a more personal way, which is going to be so helpful, especially at this present moment, right? So there are super faithful, super successful Orthodox Christian communities and ministries that are already using this small groups model and are piloting this small groups model. So that's number one. Number two, if we look at the scripture, Jesus himself had a kind of small groups model when it came to the disciples that he surrounded himself with. It's a model, a personal model that's actually very scriptural. And if we go and we look at the way that Jesus conducted his earthly ministry, we'll see that. But first, I want to kind of have a point of contrast, right? The way that we sometimes tend to do ministries in our communities. We sometimes tend to think that like the parish priest or the ministry leader has to be involved with everything. If there's a youth group, he's got to show up. If there's a young adult group, he's got to show up. He's got to be in charge of everything. He has to do this. And honestly, I think that's kind of an unfair level of expectation that we as parishioners have for some of our clergy. Our clergy do wonderful work and they have so many responsibilities on their plate. And when we have this very narrow model of ministry, as if the priests have to be doing everything and have to have their hands involved in everything, that could be a danger of burnout. And it can actually be sort of like a way that we limit the impact of the gospel by putting too much on the shoulders of too few people. It can be hard, it can be constricting, it can be unhealthy. And I think it's an unfair expectation that we as parishioners have on some of our clergy. And I get where it comes from. It comes out of our love and it comes out of our joy because we love our clergy so much. But there's a way for us to kind of magnify the impact of the gospel, to empower different levels of people to have different levels of responsibility when it comes to sharing in this ministry, sharing the ministry. And that's exactly what Christ does. Because contrast this model, right, where one or two people have to do everything in a community and are super overburdened, with the way Jesus did things during the course of his earthly ministry. Because if you go and you look at the scripture, sometimes we think, right, it's just Jesus and the 12 apostles, but that's missing some nuance. Jesus had his three core disciples, right, Peter, James, and John, who went up with him, right, at the transfiguration, right, who were there with him praying in the garden. He had his 12 disciples, his 12 apostles that he sent out, but he had his 70 apostles as well. And in the gospel according to Luke, we actually read about how Jesus had his 70 apostles and he divided them up into groups of two and he sent them out to do work. He sent them out to do ministry. There were multiple layers of responsibility, sort of the people who were closest to Jesus, the closest inner circle, and then kind of these concentric circles going outward. Different levels of relationship with the Lord, different levels of responsibility to share this ministry. So Jesus is there with his 3, with his 12, with his 70, ministering to them and then sending them out to minister to people in the world. And the cool thing is this sort of model, this model where multiple people are empowered to do ministry, it's something that we can see in the small groups model, but it's also something that we already see in really wonderful, successful examples of ministry in the church today. So the small groups model is more like this, right? We'll have our parish priest in our community. Then we have our ministry directors or our small group directors. There's our small group leaders, right? Which you guys are going to hopefully be very soon as well. People who are in charge of your own individual small groups to help lead and facilitate and minister to people. And then small group participants. And different people have this share of ministry. Different people have responsibilities in terms of proclaiming the good news and sharing the good news and living this intentional sort of Christian community with people. And like I said, we see this already, right? Because think of what Sunday school is. We have a director of a Sunday school program in a particular community. That director of Sunday school doesn't personally go and teach every single student. The director of the Sunday school, who probably reports to and consults with the parish priest, has a bunch of teachers. And the teachers are the ones who each have their own small group. That's essentially what a classroom is, right? Each of them have their own small group. The director prepares the small group leaders, the teachers. They go and they do their great work with the students every year. And the director is there to check in, to make sure they have the resources they need, right? And the priest is there to oversee it all. No one person is single-handedly going and doing all of this work. This concept that we call Sunday school is broken up into these smaller communities. And sometimes we come together as a whole, and sometimes we have just kind of our classroom work, and it all makes sense. Or think about summer camp, right? Summer camp is another amazing example of this. We might have a camp director who's in charge of a camp. You might have maybe a boys director and a girls director for the different halves of the camp. And then there are camp counselors. And each of the camp counselors, in turns, has a cabin full of kids that he or she watches for a week or a session at camp. So there's no one person that is responsible for everybody. And there's a time during the course of the camp schedule when everybody comes together for big things, and there's activities and meals. Everybody comes together, right? And that's appropriate, and it's good for everybody to come together into this big group. But there's also really wonderful work that happens at summer camp on the cabin level. And each cabin is led by a couple of camp counselors. And there's a bunch of cabins in the summer camp, right? So there's big group work that happens, and there's more focused work that happens. So if you think about it, Sunday school already kind of follows this small group model. Summer camp already kind of follows this small group model. What I'm suggesting here is maybe we can take this model and use it to break up other big ministries that would happen across the church to allow space for when things are big, for us all to come together into a big group, but also have this opportunity for more intimate, more personal, small group connection in the same way that happens in our Sunday school classrooms and in our cabins at summer camp. And the great thing about this, right, is that when we do this, it's not about having more experts. Because think about this in the summer camp context, right? Most of the, I've done summer camp for many, many years. Some of you might have done summer camp as well. You don't need a seminary degree to be a good camp counselor. You don't need a theological degree or to be ordained or anything like that to be a good camp counselor. You need to be a good listener. You need to love the kids that are entrusted to your care. You've got to be open with them. You've got to watch out for them and work your hardest to make sure that they have a really wonderful experience at summer camp. That's what it's all about, because so much of what a camp counselor does is simply bring people together, listen, provide a lending ear, be an example, right? But just sort of facilitate to make sure that the kids have a great time together. That's kind of what I'm talking about here when it comes to this small group model. We don't need like super trained theologians who are instructing in every cabin. We don't need super trained theologians who are teaching in every small group, because it's not simply about that. It's not about connecting people with the message. It's about connecting people with each other for good connection, for good discussion, for time that is well spent intentionally with Christians in kindness and love, where we can talk about what's on our minds, we can share what's on our hearts, and it can be a place where we can live this intentional, connective sort of community. It's a place where we can be seen and heard and appreciated as human beings. And it doesn't take an expert to do that. It takes somebody who cares, it takes somebody who can be a good listener, and it takes somebody who can bring people together in intentional community. And more of us do it than we may realize. More of us are capable of that than we may realize. So what's the role of a small group leader? I think we've seen some examples, right, with the Sunday school teacher, summer camp counselor, sort of more on all fours, though, in terms of what the role is. The way that I envision it, though, it's the role of a small group leader. It's kind of like a conductor in an orchestra, right? The conductor is not there to sing. The conductor is not there to be the star of the show and to have the main part in terms of the music. The conductor is there to make sure that there's harmony, to make sure that the orchestra, all these diverse instruments and pieces of music and ensembles kind of come together to make beautiful music, right? And I think that's really the goal of the Sunday school teacher. You're not there, or the small group leader. You're not there to lecture. You're not there to teach. You're not there to be the star of the show. You don't have to be an expert in any sort of way. You're there to facilitate. You're there to conduct the orchestra rather than be the star musician yourself. You're there to bring people together so something beautiful can happen, because Christ tells us, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am. And the small group leader is connecting 2 or 3 or 4 in the Lord's name. So to help you do this, as a small group leader in your community or whatever other ministry you're a part of, I want to share 8 principles to help you lead great discussions, to help you with this work that you're going to do as a small group leader. And it's important work, and it's critical work now more than ever, especially given that so much of our ministry, all of our ministry at the moment, is online. And it's so hard for us to connect with each other online at the moment. There's a lot of resources that are available for you. I want to remind you to go to y2am.org/small groups. There you can see on your screen, we have guidebooks for small group directors whoever's going to be in charge of the program, whatever it looks like at the parish. For small group leaders, that's you. And for participants, those resources have some how-tos. They've got some technical help, right? If you've never used Zoom before as a participant, kind of little things along those lines. But besides that, this conversation, this training webinar is to give you 8 principles to help you lead those great conversations on a weekly basis. On this page as well, the small groups page, you're also going to find copies of the slides that I'm using here, a recording of this webinar as well, and a PDF that has some of the 8 principles, all of the 8 principles that I'm mentioning today, so you can have that as a handy sort of reference to go and turn to. So everything you need is going to be there, along with a weekly curriculum that we're putting together. So everything you need, one-stop shopping, y2am.org/small groups. But that's there. I want to get into these 8 principles right now, and then afterwards we'll open for questions to see if anybody has any questions. Principle 1 of the 8 basic principles that you need to lead great conversations, to be a good small group leader: stay neutral and don't judge. So we said before, remember, the role of the small group leader is to be the conductor, not the musician. We all have our own opinions. We all have our own viewpoints on whatever sort of conversation we're happening. And it's natural for these opinions to come up, right, during a discussion that we have. But when we're facilitating a conversation, when we're bringing people together, we have to remember our role. We are conducting. We're not there to dominate. We're not there to impose. Our opinions should not overpower the conversation. And if a group member has an opposite view or opinion from you, that participant should not be corrected or shamed, right? Your goal is to create a safe place to stay neutral so people can share, so people can come together, so people can grow. You're there to be the conductor, to get the best possible music, the most beautiful music out of somebody, not to tell them to be quiet. Your job isn't to correct. It's not to teach. It's not to inform. It's not to dominate. It's not to win an argument, right? It's to be that conductor. It's to invisibly direct the discussion to where it's fruitful. So all participants are given the chance to speak, to be heard, to be seen, because that is really what's going to allow people to come together. Their space, their safety. And the way that you do that as a small group leader is you stay neutral and don't judge, because you're there to be the conductor. So principle number 1 of being a great small groups leader: stay neutral and don't judge. Principle number 2 for how to be a great small groups leader and lead great discussions: establish ground rules. So ground rules establish boundaries and safety in a group, okay? Ground rules are kind of like the contract that we in a small group have. These are the rules of the road. This is the way we're going to interact. And the goal is to have it to be clear, crystal clear from the very beginning. These are the boundaries. This is how we do things. This is how we operate as a small group. We come together. These are the boundaries. We don't color outside the lines. At your first meeting, before you actually start a discussion, it's helpful to create these ground rules, to achieve consensus about these ground rules, so that everyone feels comfortable sharing and speaking and everybody knows where they stand. We've included 8 model ground rules in the small group leader PDF on the webpage that I showed you earlier. So there's 8 that can be a starting point. Feel free to add your own. Feel free to subtract any that you don't want. There's some examples of what's in there. Allow everyone the chance to speak. Try not to overshare. Practice active listening when others are speaking. Be respectful. No laughing at comments of other participants. Speak one at a time. These are all examples of ground rules. Everybody knows we're only going to be speaking one at a time. That's one of the ground rules potentially of our small group. And this is something that you want everybody to come together to shape. You can sort of offer a few as a model, but the goal is for everybody to buy into this. This is all of us committing together as a small group to talk in this way, to interact in this way. Here's one really important ground rule that you want to consider. How is the discussion going to go in your group? Are you going to go round robin? You know, is the goal for everybody to get a turn? You sort of go around the circle, you know, figuratively in this context. Or is it going to be a free-for-all discussion? That's important, right? And that's a ground rule that you establish at the very beginning, because that changes the tenor of the conversation. At the very least, everybody knows. If it's round robin, you simply go around and everybody gets to turn. If it's a free-for-all, do you have to raise your hand, right? Do people get called on? Again, these are things that you want to be clear about from the very beginning. Round robin, to be totally honest, might be helpful, right? It ensures that everybody gets a turn. It's especially helpful for people who might be a little bit reluctant to share on their own. which is going to be a part of the people who are involved here, right? So that's something to consider, but that's something for you and your small group to come together to do, to come to a consensus, to really agree that these are the rules of the road. These are the ground rules that are going to guide our conversations. These are the boundaries in which we are going to come together in love and fellowship to share and to grow. So principle number 2, to lead great conversations, establish ground rules. Principle number 3, to be a great small group leader, to lead great discussions, ask good questions one at a time. So remember, your role is to be the conductor rather than the musician, and you help to conduct the orchestra by asking good questions. So what's a good question? A good question is one that's open-ended rather than yes-no. It gives you space to go. A yes-no conversation doesn't facilitate anything. You ask this, yes or no, boom, you're done. But an open-ended conversation gives people space to breathe. It gives people space to wrestle and to think, and it gives people space to share. But there's a difference between being open-ended and leading. Remember, you're neutral. Like we said back in principle 1, you're not pointing people to a particular conclusion or a particular place. You want it to be open-ended so people have wiggle room and they have space to breathe, but you don't want to be sort of pushing people in one direction. That's a way that you're not being neutral and you're guiding the conversation a bit too strongly. To give you a sense of what kinds of questions you can use, we actually, every week, we're preparing a small groups curriculum, and we're posting it every week over on the page, y2am.org/smallgroups. We're basing the weekly curriculum off of the Sunday Gospel and Epistle readings. So it's a great way for you to really reflect on some of the personal stuff that comes out of the scripture, because we don't simply read the scripture to kind of learn theology. The scripture kind of reads us, and it's a way for us to be read by each other as we ask some of these questions. So there are some good open-ended questions that you can use there in the curriculum. Again, the important thing, right, is ask those open questions and ask them one at a time. When we ask too many questions at once, it muddles people's minds, right? Which question am I answering? It can confuse things, and that actually stifles conversation, and it makes it harder to think, and it makes it harder to share. So ask these good questions one at a time. That's the third principle for leading great conversations. And that leads us into the next one. Principle 4 of being a great small group leader, leading great conversations, don't be afraid of silence. So I have been a part of a lot of conversations and discussions, right? And I've seen that a lot of discussion leaders will ask a question, they'll be faced with a little bit of silence, and then they'll panic when no one responds quickly enough for them. So what do? They will fill that silence with distracting comments, or even worse, with more questions, right? More questions, which contradicts what we said just a second ago in principle 3. The trouble, though, is that when you ask a good open-ended question, people need time to think. People need time to process. Don't be afraid of the silence. Silence is a good thing. Silence is an opportunity for people to wrestle with the conversation. In fact, as a small group leader, you might actually want to consider building that into your model. You can specifically ask people to journal. So you ask a question, and then you give them like 2 minutes, and they can write down what their thoughts, and then based on what they write down, as they organize their thoughts, then people can begin sharing. So silence can actually be a part of your schedule, so to speak. Whatever you do, don't be afraid of it. And certainly don't seek to overly fill that silence with distractions or with more questions, which is just going to actually undermine the good work that people are doing in that silence. People need a few seconds to think and process, right? I'm sure you do. When you've been asked a good question, sometimes you need a pause. Silence is part of a good conversation. Don't be afraid of it. Consider even facilitating it, right? Like we said, journaling can be a part of your small group experience. That's something when it comes to your ground rules, how you're going to be doing it on a weekly basis. However you treat it, don't be afraid of silence. That's principle number 4 for being a great small groups leader. Don't be afraid of silence. Principle number 5, to be a great small groups leader, to lead great discussions, invite and manage participation. You are going to find a range of personalities in your group. On the one hand, you're going to have people who are a bit less reluctant to share, right? Or more reluctant to share, I should say. They're going to need encouragement to open up, right? This is where the rules of the game can help. If you have somebody who's maybe a little bit shy, maybe a little bit hesitant to actually open up, this is where it can be helpful to have a round robin format where everybody gets a turn. There's no need to jump in, right? There's perfect safety. That's one sort of option. So that's where you have to figure out how are you going to invite participation. You can even sort of structure it into the round robin model. Or do you invite participation by seeing people when they haven't shared, by personally addressing them, saying, I'd love to hear from you, right? That's something for you to consider. To not force, but to gently invite participation. And you're going to want to manage participation too, because some people are going to be reluctant to share. Some people are going to love sharing and are going to have no problem sharing and are potentially going to be over sharers who could dominate the conversation. So with kindness, you need to make sure that that proper boundaries are maintained. So everybody can be seen, but not heard. You know, if there's 6 or 8 people in the room and only 2 people are actually talking, that's not a conversation at that point. You can't let people, and again, out of no sort of badness or anything, right? Just their own exuberance and their own personality. You just want to make sure to pump the brakes where needed. Say, you know, thank you for your contribution. These are really, really great points, but it's also important that we hear from people who haven't shared yet. Would anybody else like to share? Or look somebody particular, say, we haven't heard from you in a while. Would you like to share, right? Invite participation, don't force it. Manage participation, make sure that everybody gets a turn and that people aren't unintentionally dominating the conversation. Balance. Balance is going to make sure that everybody has a chance to participate and that this is a real opportunity for people with safety and love to come together, to know each other and be known by each other. So principle 5 of having great conversations, being a great small groups leader, invite and manage participation. Principle number 6 of being a great small groups leader, of having great conversations, leading great conversations, redirect to reach the goal. When you ask open questions that aren't leading, you give people space to explore and to wrestle, which is great, but you want to make sure that everyone's staying on topic. That can happen sometimes, right? Sometimes we lose sight of the initial question and we're following rabbit trails, right? We're sort of going off in all sorts of tangents and all sorts of directions. That can happen in a small groups conversation as well. And that's where you come in as the leader, as the facilitator. If the conversation is losing its focus, you can bring it back with another open-ended question. You can restate the original question. You can sort of like focus on a particular part of it, right? Or you can restate a comment that one of the participants offered. You can sort of summarize something somebody said, restate something that somebody said, and use that as an anchor to kind of bring the conversation back towards that initial question, if we're going too far afield. When you redirect, you make sure you're not kind of like forcing people to go in a particular direction, but there's a question on the table. You want to make sure that we're not sort of going off and telling irrelevant stories, that we're sort of losing track. You want to make sure that that question is still on the table. And when we redirect by restating questions, by restating something that somebody has shared as an anchor point to get us back, it helps us to get to that goal of addressing the question that's on the table. So principle number 6 of leading great conversations, being a great small groups leader, redirect to reach the goal. Principle number 7, summarize as you go. So this I kind of alluded to in the last point as well. Summarizing can be a way, or restating can be a way to bring people back when the conversation goes too far afield, but it's also a way to create breaks in the conversation. So after your group has spent some time on a particular question, you can simply ask, okay, what have we said so far? And what you do at that point is you invite people to take a break in the conversation. They get to sort of organize their thoughts again. They get to highlight some of the things that have already been shared. It's a chance to take a breath, to gather your thoughts, and then start exploring again. It's kind of like you downshift a little bit. What have we said so far? No need for something new. No need for some sort of groundbreaking insights. Have we been listening to each other? Have we been connecting to each other? What have we shared so far? It's a great way to encourage conversation, because when you do this and people in the group start sharing things that others have said, you demonstrate that people are being heard because their contributions are being summarized and highlighted. It's kind of like when you're in a conversation, there's a difference between somebody just looking at you blankly and saying, and being able to restate what you've said. So when the participants in a group can summarize, can restate what's been said, it demonstrates to people my contributions are valued. People are hearing me, people are seeing me. So it's a nice thing every now and again, at some point in the conversation, to pump the brakes a little bit. Okay, what have we said so far? How can we summarize and restate what's already been shared and highlight to assure people that they're being heard, and to give people space to breathe? So that's principle number 7 of being a great small groups leader, leading great conversations, summarize as you go. And finally, principle number 8 of being a great small groups leader, leading great conversations, tie it all together. When your time comes together, right, at the end of your allotted hour or however long you're going to meet every week, it's important to tie everything together. If you have seen the sample curriculum that we offer 3 guiding questions that you can use to tie everything together at the end of your small groups time as the small groups leader. So here are those questions that can be sort of like on the back of your mind, 3 questions that you simply use week in, week out to help you put a bow on the conversation and send everybody off on the right foot. First question that we offer is, what are you grateful to have learned or heard in the conversation? It's an opportunity for you to recognize somebody, to highlight again something that you're grateful for, something that was shared, it might have been difficult to share, or something powerful that was said. What are you grateful to have learned or heard in the conversation? Second sample question that we give is, what simple statement or question from the conversation can you share again that would be most helpful to hear again 3 years from now? Right? What was something that is actually going to be valuable to take away? To again, recognize something good that happened, something important that was said here, a word that God gave us in the midst of our time together that's going to be relevant for us, not 6 months from now, but years from now. What would you like to highlight? Again, as the small group leader, what would you like to highlight? And the third, if you could share up to 12 words on the topic of, we change that every week, whatever the topic that is kind of coming out in the scripture readings, what would you say? Not to dominate the conversation, but a short, simple sentence or 2, 12 words that you would offer on this particular topic. 12 words that you've heard, right? 12 words that are coming to you as you're synthesizing everything that everybody has said. It's a way for you to, again, summarize, highlight, tie up the conversation, and give people something in their hearts to really continue to wrestle with as everybody goes back to their lives. And as you're tying it up, perhaps the most important thing that you can offer is your thanks. Thanks to your fellow group members for being open and honest and vulnerable, for opening their hearts to each other and to the Lord. It's a really beautiful thing, right? People are there, they're being open, they're being honest, they're sharing. It's really, really important to offer your thanks as the small group leader, as the conductor that's bringing this beautiful music out of everybody. So here are the 8 principles to lead great conversations, to lead great discussions, to be a great small groups leader. 1, stay neutral and don't judge. 2, establish ground rules. Do that before you even start your work, before your first conversation. 3, ask good questions, not leading questions, good questions, one at a time. 4, don't be afraid of silence. Silence is where work happens. Don't be afraid of silence. 5, invite, but don't force participation. Invite and manage participation. 6, redirect to reach the goal. If you're going sort of off on rabbit trails, redirect to reach the goal, the question that's on the table. 7, summarize as you go, takes a break. And then 8, tie it all together at the very end, especially with thanks. So one last reminder, at the small groups page, y2am.org/smallgroups, that's where you're going to find a recording of this webinar. You're going to find the slides from this webinar. I will post those shortly. A PDF that has a summary of those 8 principles as well. You're going to find guidebooks for directors of small groups at parishes, for small group leaders and small group participants, which has kind of how-to and checklists and some technical support for people who may not know how to use Zoom and platforms like that, and the weekly curriculum. So there's a lot of great stuff that you're going to find over there, y2am.org/smallgroups. The other thing I'll suggest is that if you're here, it's because you're into creative solutions for the ministry challenges that we're facing today. This is something that we're doing with this new ministry training course that we put together, Effective Christian Ministry. It's our online training course. It's got 3 modules. It's a way for you to really understand some of the challenges that we face in contemporary ministry, how to turn those challenges into opportunities, and how to do so with 5 core practices that can be a part of the ministry. And that can actually inform the way that you lead your small groups as well. So I want to give you, I mentioned an offer, I want to give you 50% off registration for the course. So if you go to effectivechristianministry.org and you type in the code smallgroups50, smallgroups50, all one word, you'll get 50% off the normal registration amount. And there's a lot of great information in there. There's already 400 something people who have joined. We didn't launch the course a long time ago. Like, I'm really amazed by how many people are benefiting from this already. It's a really great opportunity to continue to be creative, to continue to be faithful, and to come up with some really interesting ways to address some of the ministry challenges that we face today.